This week, Adam Pennington from Mitre is with us to discuss Mitre Att&ck. Stay tuned for this edition of Below the Surface.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 32 for Wednesday, June 19th, 2024. We are pre-recording this edition, so if stuff transpires in the meantime, it's because we have a time machine, or it's broken, so we can't see into the future. I'm, of course, Paul Asadorian, joined by Alan Alford. Alan, welcome.
Howdy, thanks.
It's good to have you, Alan. And of course, just a quick announcement for Below the Surface listeners who can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. We've got many resources there for you, including the ultimate guide to supply chain security, another on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can also sign up for a demo. All that on eclipsium.com/go. We are excited to have Adam Pennington, the attack lead from Mitre, with us today. Adam has collected much of the intelligence leveraged in creating Att&ck's initial techniques. He spent much of his 15 years with Mitre studying and preaching the use of deception for intelligence gathering. Before joining Mitre, Adam was a researcher at Carnegie Mellon's Parallel Data Lab and earned a BS and MS degrees in computer science and electrical engineering, as well as a 2017 Alumni Service Award from Carnegie Mellon University. Adam's presented at many conferences, including Usenix, DEF CON, and more. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be here today.
Yeah, it's nice to have you, Adam. I want to start by asking how you got your start in information security. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, and so I come out of a somewhat traditional background that, I really enjoy working with a lot of people who are career switchers and came from other places. I came out of a computer science background. I've always had somewhat of an interest in computer security back to the bulletin board system days. And so ended up as a PhD student focused on storage systems and computer security. I went straight out of academia into Mitre 15 years ago into our cybersecurity organization. And I've been all over the place within Mitre, from being a sort of pure researcher, working with various adversary data, doing a lot of deception work, to working with some of Mitre's government sponsors. And most recently, been involved with Att&ck and leading it the last 4 years now.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm jealous when it said you had a degree in electrical and computer engineering, and you were recently doing some hardware hacking, which puts you at a great advantage over me. I hack my way through the hardware hacking. You've got some formal training on it, which is awesome.
I have a good time. And most of my touching hardware comes at home. My home lab is because Att&ck is kind of a glorified spreadsheet in a lot of ways.
Sure.
Working with fairly soft data, but yeah, in my free time, I like playing with a lot of radio gear, things like that.
That's awesome. Adam, tell us a little bit about Att&ck. I remember covering this as it was breaking right over the past several years, when we're like, oh, Mitre has this framework, and everyone's like really, I think, still really excited about it. But in the beginning, tell us about how it came to fruition.
Sure. Att&ck came out of an internal need we had. We had a project going internally called the Fort Meade experiment, and no ties to any particular government organization where that can be a euphemism. It just happened to be at Mitre's Fort Meade site.
Mm-hmm.
We were running this program where we were doing a lot of sensing on end systems, trying to see what we could see post-exploitation. And we were doing a series of red and blue team exercises. Purple teaming wasn't really a term yet.
Sure.
And we wanted a way for the red team to be able to form a plan and compare notes to the blue team. And there just wasn't a common language for doing that.
Right.
And so some folks at Mitre took a bunch of internal data that we had gathered from various honeypots, The piece we're talking about, gathering the data from deception environments, comes in, categorizing what we saw into different tactics. So the columns that are in attack, so the high level pieces, the individual cells, the techniques, so the particular actions that the adversaries were taking. And we found it pretty useful for our internal organization. And that was all the way back in 2013. Fast forward a couple of years, in 2015, we had all the permissions lined up to put it out in public. We thought other people might find it useful too. And so we put it out there as a open source project with no idea if anyone was ever going to use it, if it was going to stay alive really at Mitre. And it just kind of exploded from there.
Yeah. It's interesting how it was very quickly adopted and embraced by the industry. And, kind of to your earlier comment, Adam, that doesn't always happen, right? A lot of people create guides, frameworks that don't see adoption, but I feel like Mitre Att&ck, OWASP Top 10, and I'm probably missing a couple other major ones, are the ones that really took off. Why do you think that Att&ck was adopted so easily and widespread as it was?
For us at the time, it felt a little bit slow at first. So, I
Okay.
mean, the first 2 years, it took a little bit of time to build as people sort of found it in like 2015, 2016, 2017. But as people looked at it, people that had hands-on experience working with adversaries, incidents, and things like that looked at the techniques that we had in attack, the behaviors that we had cataloged in our knowledge base, and they went, that seems like the right things. That's what I think of when I think of adversaries. It isn't a lot of speculative stuff. And so this is all only driven by threat intelligence. It's things we've seen real world
Hmm.
threat actors do. And I think people saw a difference with that over some of the work that had gone before, trying to catalog everything in the universe that any adversary could do, where you'd have things that just realistically never happened from real threat actors, or only a red team would do in a stunt hack. They're bored, they want to finish out an engagement, they're doing something extra creative that they really wanted to do, and that's not what the real world looks like. And so I think people recognized that match. Our philosophy has always been to try to be practical rather than right. We're not trying to do the perfect anything. We're trying to do something useful.
Mm.
And so I think that has also served us well as it being out there and free, and not coming from any particular vendor.
Yeah, and so who can influence Attack in terms of suggesting that a technique be modified and or a new technique be added to the framework?
Absolutely anybody, and anybody does. We have
Mm,
hundreds of contributors to Attack at this point. And it's not just the United States. We get contributions and suggestions from all around the world, pretty much every continent over time. Tons of companies, individuals, other governments. It's basically things that people are seeing and not finding in Attack. And so we
mhm.
have this constant stream of people sending stuff to us.
And how do you vet when people make recommendations, Adam?
So a lot of us come from threat intelligence backgrounds
Mm,
where we're somewhat used to doing source vetting in the data that we work with on a regular basis. And we apply very similar principles. If we're looking at threat intelligence reports, we're looking at the quality of the report, where it came from, the provenance of it, and other characteristics too. Is this believable? Is it consistent? Is it spelled right?
mm,
Even some of those quality metrics can give you an idea of is a report you should be working with. And then we base our decision on some of those exact same sorts of characteristics when it's somebody coming to us directly and saying, "Hey, I saw a thing. Somebody talked about it at Black Hat last year as something you could do. So there's a citation out there for it, but it really happened."
mm.
And so our decision to trust that is exactly like you'd vet any other intelligence source. Is it coming from somewhere we trust? We've built up a relationship, and if not, we're potentially going to other trusted parties in industry that have good visibility and saying, can you find this? And so not everything that's going into Attack is coming out of reports that are out there in public. We don't add a technique we can't cite somewhere. We don't want to be the first people describing for an adversary how something's done, but the information that it's real may be coming to us through private
Mhm.
sources or under NDA, et cetera.
Yeah, and it's interesting recent events, I think, kind of highlight that. Of course, we'd be remiss not to mention that Mitre itself was the victim of an attack, and I'm
Yep.
assuming your incident response process, that's real world hands-on experience, that probably funnels into programs such as Attack and probably others, correct?
Oh, we are absolutely paying attention to what happened with that, looking at are there gaps. And in fact, some of the blog posts MITRE puts out covers some activities that happened with VMware ESXi
Mhm,
in that intrusion that I don't think are really adequately covered in Attack today.
mhm,
That's a little bit of a gap we need to think more about because we also don't really explicitly cover VMware ESXi at all
mm,
today. And we have Linux. ESXi is not Linux. We don't have sort of a generic tag for it. So we're trying to figure out how to cover that hypervisor space. Yeah, some of the stuff that they did in that was very interesting, and we would treat that as a threat report, just like we would any other,
right.
in being a valid source for us.
Yeah, and along the lines of real world attacks too, I'm assuming did XZ in that chronicle of that story, did that make you think about certain techniques that might need to be modified or changed?
Yeah, no, and we're always keeping an eye out on is there anything that doesn't quite align with our current scoping? Are there techniques that it's an adversary did something that is just a nidge off
Mhm,
from what we talk about today, or a new procedure that expands our scope a little bit. And so we're always going back and looking at what we need to do. And in fact, if you look at attack releases, most of what we put out are updates to existing techniques. And that's by design.
mhm,
We want our modifications to the high level techniques, sort of the cells in the big spreadsheet, to change as little as possible, especially that list, because we know we break a lot of products when we start messing with that too much. Sub techniques under them, the next layer down, we modify a bit more often, we add to a bit more often, and then the scope on those techniques changes more than that. And so, is there another platform you need to describe? So, is there a way to do this technique under Linux that we weren't considering before, or something like that? And so, yeah, any of these intrusions, we're going back and checking our assumptions. Does it fit into what we're describing today? And what do we need to change to make it fit?
Alan, you had some more technical questions as to how the techniques and tactics were
Yeah,
laid
yeah,
out, and there
yeah.
was a
So I'm
good progression to that, yeah.
huge Attack fanboy here. First of all, let's start with
Awesome.
that. I've done some crazy stuff with it. I've done some mappings with it, and I know you guys have mapped it to 853. And I've done some other mappings myself, working with the techniques and the mitigations. And I noticed that we've got also something called detections and something called procedure examples. And I'm wondering
Yep.
if you can elaborate on those because I'm well familiar with techniques and mitigations. I've used those both now for years. But what are the other two? What are the I mean, I think I know what detections means, but what are procedure examples?
Well, and so detections actually came first in terms of attack. And so attack has always been descriptions of real world adversary behavior from an adversary point of view, coupled with defensive mechanisms. We don't want to just be telling you what's bad,
Hmm.
what's going wrong. We want to be coupling it with here's something you might be able to do about it. And so within attack, we have detections and mitigations for starters. Detections are how you might find that activity going on in your environment. And we've been doing considerable upgrades to detections over the past year. So we've gone from where all of our detections used to be fairly vague descriptions, where you needed to know what you were doing to be able to take those and implement them in your environment. And we realized there are less resource defenders out there that we wanted to help a little bit better. And so we've started adding first what we call detection notes in there. And detection notes are where we say, like, go check this event log ID
Hmm.
or this particular log in order to be able to see this. And we've also been adding analytics. So pseudocode where you might be able to take it and modify it a bit, of course, to match your environment, but put it right into your sim
Right.
and be able to find that technique. Mitigation, similarly, are ways that you might stop that activity from happening in
Hmm.
the first place or be able to mitigate the consequence of it. Procedures were something we added a little bit later, and actually, that term procedures we didn't add for a couple of years into attack's history. Although we sort of realized, well, we've got tactics, we've got techniques. What's missing there out of TTPs? But so procedures are specific adversary examples of how a technique's been done. So coupled with a particular adversary, a particular campaign, or a particular piece of software
Hmm.
that adversaries have used. And so instead of, somebody has done phishing, spear phishing attachment, it would be APT29 has attached Excel documents with malicious macros.
Nice. Much more prescriptive detail. I like that. Um, let's drill into the procedures a little bit, if you don't mind. I know that they start with like techniques all start with T, mitigations all start with M, and procedures can start with a G, a C, or an S in terms of their numeric designators. Like what are the three tags for? And what do those represent?
Yeah, and so it's because of where that data is actually coming from. So the way that we're adding adversary activity into attack is from group pages, campaign pages, and software pages.
Hmm.
Groups are your named threat groups, so folks like your APT29, APT3, or any of over 100 different names that we've added into attack, along with a lot of associated group names. So we track a lot of different companies' names for overlapping activity. Campaigns are time bounded sets of activity. So it might be tied to a particular threat actor. So it might be activity that APT 28 did over like a 2 month period that has a lot of ties together. Or it could be unidentified activity. So we don't know who it was, but it's clustered somehow. And that's helped us a lot with being able to track like ransomware groups
Hmm.
where the threat groups can get really messy. And then software, we also track what attack techniques, malware, and tools that adversaries use can be actually accomplished by them. So we'll take completely legitimate tools that adversaries are using that are not intended to be malware, and mapping out all the things an adversary can use them for, as well as straight up malware where they were written and purpose designed for that. And so that's the S. So yeah, G is groups, C is campaigns, S is software.
And Adam, Mitre Att&ck is tracking if an existing APT group uses a new technique that gets updated in attack.
Yeah, so I was talking about how we will take private information in order to add a technique to attack. That's not the case with group software and campaigns.
Hmm.
It has to come from publicly available open source threat intelligence reporting that we can cite. So if a new report comes out and says APT 29 is doing this new thing that we didn't know they were doing, we might add that report to attack, add all the techniques from it, potentially even add a new technique to attack if it describes something we can't today. And so we have a team led by Joe Slowick, who's out there watching the reporting, taking in contributions from people very similar to techniques where
Hmm.
people are saying, there's this report that APT 28 is doing this thing. Why don't you have it yet? And we're adding that in.
Yeah, that's really great. Our view from Eclipsium, right? I look at if a new threat actor group is starting to attack something like EFI, right? That's
Mhm.
just one thing that I follow very closely. But I think organizations will find it useful to kind of know what the different groups are doing. And if they can use attack for some of that, I didn't know that it actually tracked all that as closely as I thought.
Yeah, and so it's we are of course limited in what we can do, and we're resource limited for one,
Hmm.
and there's a ton of reporting coming out, and so we are never going to be everything that a particular threat group is doing. We are, however, mapping what we believe to be a fairly reliable set of techniques that can be mapped to that group. We're using reports that we trust, using some of the same mechanisms I talked about for believing intelligence. And have high confidence in the mappings that are being done from that reporting.
Yep.
And so it at least gives you a baseline for a particular group. We believe that at least if you go to a particular group page, look at the techniques in there, it does present you a ground for stuff that particular actor is doing. And if you're worried about a particular actor a lot, it may be a great place to start.
Mm-hmm.
I've got another question here, if you don't mind, Paul.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Al.
Most of my attack experience has been, I'll admit, sort of second stage, if you will. In other words, the vendor community has totally embraced attack. There are all these vendors out there that are doing all kinds of whiz bang things with it. I've personally, in my past, like I said, done some mappings and cross mappings, and I know you guys have everything available on, I think it's GitHub, right?
Yeah, everything's on GitHub as a sticks representation, so it's all
Yep.
machine readable data.
So it's all sticks taxi. So that's kind of that's the question that I had is, the integrations into the greater world of cybersecurity products, right? Like we live in a world where there's 8 million products out there trying to do, 8 million twists and nuances to solving the cyber problems. How much do you guys see yourselves going further with integration, maybe APIs, maybe, how deeply enmeshed in the private sector cybersecurity solutions world do you guys see yourselves getting over time?
I mean, we put the data out and we license it such that people can do pretty much anything with it they want
Mm-hmm.
as long as they give us credit somewhere. It's a very open and unrestricted license. Everything that appears on the attack website is in our sticks representation.
Nice.
And I mean, at least for the attack knowledge base. And we can be sure of that because we generate the website from the sticks knowledge base. And the codes, we also open source the code that does that. Are we going to do a different API than Taxi as a way to serve up the data? Probably not.
Okay.
Taxis, um,
If it ain't broke.
maintaining one API out there is enough and expensive enough in AWS
Right.
for us to host. We actually love it when people use their representation in GitHub because we don't pay that bill. But and so we're probably not going to go into sort of more towards the API side. We did recognize that a lot of individuals and smaller groups working with attack sticks was a bit too much. It's a somewhat complicated JSON format that to actually parse and pull everything together can require a decent amount of coding knowledge. And so we started releasing official versions of attack in Excel.
Yeah.
And so the Excel is generated from sticks, but it's,
Yep.
I think a ton of people use that version as well.
Yeah, I've used Excel a lot over the years.
Yeah, and it's a lot less complicated to work with than sticks if all you're doing is some relatively simple analysis on attack. If you're sort of pulling in the whole thing and integrating it into your product, you probably want the sticks.
I had a quick supply chain question, Adam. I wanted to get your take on how supply chain security issues have kind of weaved their way into attack and maybe what the future might bring for helping it using attack to help describe supply chain threats and detections.
So that actually comes up fairly often in that supply chain isn't something that's called out very much in attack. And so companies in that space often come to us in that space. And so we do have sort of a specific supply chain technique, but the way that we fit into supply chain is often a bit more subtle than that. And so I like to think of it as two parallel kill chains to get completely into a different framework than attack, where you've got a set of attack techniques and a pathway that's being done to get into the supply chain itself.
Mm-hmm.
And generally, you can describe that in attack. So, like everything that happened in the SolarWinds breach that the adversary did to SolarWinds, to Microsoft, to the other spaces is representable in attack. At least it is now. We had to add a couple techniques for some of the cloud activities they did. And that's how we roll.
Mm-hmm.
And so up to the point where it actually moved over to the end victim, you can cover an attack. And then you sort of shift over. You go back to initial access and attack again and sort of start the next intrusion at the supply chain technique. And so we see it we see it like that, where supply chain actually fits into the existing tactics and techniques. We haven't really called it out as much or isolated the techniques that are going to be just specifically used for supply chain, but most of what's going on there to get into, especially software supply chain, is decently well covered in attack. A hardware maybe a little bit less so, just because you don't attack is based on threat intelligence that's out there, and frankly, the threat intelligence special that we can work with on much happening to hardware supply chains a little bit thin.
Yeah, I think directly attacking the hardware in the hardware supply chain are less frequently occurring. Certainly high
Good.
impact incidents, but much less frequently occurring because it involves a human being physically present somewhere to put something tangible inside of something, right? If you limit it to that style of hardware attack. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of what we sort of consider hardware attacks starts to get back into software too. I mean,
Yeah.
UEFI is software.
Yeah. I was, it's funny. I was listening to our coworkers did Mickey and Jesse an interview on a different podcast, and they were describing UEFI, and I was like, is it an operating system? Can we treat it like an pure operating system? But not really. It's really a bunch of code that's running, not really
Yep.
an operating system per se. But I was having that debate in my head, which I think the more we can define things and come up with a common language around it, which is what attack is doing, the better off we are from a defensive standpoint in going, okay, now that I know what to call this or what to look for, now I can adjust my defenses in my process.
And even that area specifically, I mean, I did a podcast a while ago with Red Canary looking specifically at UEFI and BIOS stuff. And we found that most of the documented adversary activity you can map pretty well to attack. That, it's we're at least hitting most of the high notes. And again, we do something like that. We look at a particular threat and we find gaps. I'm going to be going back to the Attack for Enterprise team and going, hey, I think we need to add this in the next release.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, so how are people using outside of the product vendors, right? But as an organization and defenders, how are people using attack in ways that I think you would point out as being really good? Let's start there.
So the most common way we see is people mapping out their defenses. So people using it as a way to track what they do and don't have a handle on today. And so, not something we don't recommend is trying to do that with all of attack at once. Attack has over 500 techniques and sub techniques. You try to figure out what your defenses are for every single thing in that all at once. You're going to hate me.
Yeah, and
It's too
there's
big.
areas in there too that aren't like I can put a product or some technical control. Some of the
Right.
controls are like
Exactly.
I need a process for that. Correct. That's still. I remember when attack was coming out, people were having that discussion. Still true today, obviously.
Yeah. And so mapping the defenses where it makes sense. And so prioritizing, starting out looking at things that maybe are coming in through threat intelligence or, just aligned to your products today, rather than just taking, attack a column at a time, a tactic at a time, and just going, okay, what products do I have for this? What products do I have for this? What products do I have for this? Because it's just too much. And just like you said, there are a lot of techniques in attack that either don't make sense to detect, because they're activities that system administrators do. We're describing activities that adversaries do without saying they're necessarily bad. And so we have things like directory enumeration in there. If you want to detect every time somebody types ls or dir
Huh.
across your enterprise, you're going to hate us.
Mm-hmm.
And we've certainly been blamed for people doing stuff like that. But they're like, it's an attack. We were supposed to set an alert, right? No, please don't.
Right.
And so, but having an idea where your defenses are. So, is there an entry somewhere in a log that comes out of that you might be able to put together with other activities?
Mm.
So, that directory enumeration or a lot of the rest of what happens in the discovery tactic in attack pulled together can be extremely useful information for a defender, especially for after the fact.
Yeah, I completely agree. Having done incident response and some forensics, you are looking for those things that tie together are very suspicious, right? In and of themselves, not so suspicious. But if you, I love the we get to play like the investigator role. I've always liked that about information security, right? And especially defense, is we have to go back and find all those artifacts and put them
Mhm.
together. But if you don't have those artifacts, attack is a great place to start to make sure that moving
Right.
forward you're collecting all of those artifacts so you can do the forensics investigation and solve the case, right?
Yeah,
And
my
you may
quick
eventually,
summary.
sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say my quick summary of attack. When people ask me what is it, and how do you use it, I say it's a kill chain database,
Yeah,
right? I mean, that's it. We're walking through the steps of the various bad things that they did, one at a time, one at a time, one at a time. And breach and attack simulation, to your question, Paul, is another great use in my mind. Is
absolutely.
you can aim it at yourself now that you know what it is, and what that kill chain looks like.
So probably the second most common use case we see is tracking people's cyber threat intelligence. And so just using it as a way to track what behaviors you know about for a particular actor, you know about collectively are coming at your organization. And probably third most common is that various forms of red team, where it's whether it's human, whether it's a adversary emulation system, whether it's breach and attack simulator, even though that's what attack was originally designed for. Our original intent was to have a language for the red and the blue team. It's definitely not how it's most commonly used today.
And how is it used in the vendor product space? Let's flip there as well, because there was a point in time, and I was probably doing Enterprise Security Weekly, covering what all the various cybersecurity vendors were doing. And at least once a week there was a couple of vendors adding, oh, we support Mitre Att&ck now. Like, it was big checkbox for them, right? And it was difficult to know, like, does that really help people, or are you just checking a box, right?
Well, we hope people are using it in ways that are helping people,
Yeah,
but
me too.
there's only limited to how much we can police that too. That being something that's out there for free. And
Yeah,
again,
and I don't think it's your job to police it, Adam, right?
no, and we're not the attack police. We try to put recommendations out both for best practices and worst practices, and hope that people will recognize that in their products and in themselves where they're falling into that. But I think the most common is just using it as that language for behaviors where
Hmm.
what they're tracking is behaviors. If you're seeing this particular thing, tracking it to a technique ID, so a T with four digits is super common in products. And then, the ability for if somebody's trying to track what techniques they have an answer to or just what they know about a particular incident, using that as a way to have kind of a common language between their products, being able to look back at, say, reporting coming out of the US government or different incident response companies publishing reports. And so probably the most common is using it as that common language.
Mm.
Yep. I've even seen it in GRC and CSPM spaces, mapping to other frameworks and showing how, if you're compliant over here, you're addressing attack from attack over here, technique number, whatever, T1957 or whatever. I've seen those kinds of mappings as well, which I found to be very interesting, trying to reconcile the technical realities with the broad strokes of a framework.
Yeah, another use case that we just never saw coming is how often it's used as sort of that pivot point between things because two things are both mapped to attack. We worry a little bit where if you're trying to map something through like four different pivots, is it actually meaningful still? Does A actually equal B? After you said A equals B equals C equals D, so A equals D. Maybe not. Um, and so yeah, we worry as people get a little bit too far out over their skis on some of that stuff, but um, we're happy that people are finding it useful in that space.
Which compliance frameworks or have integrated attack, Adam, and how is that going? Is that helping? Is that making things more confusing?
I don't think any of the compliance frameworks themselves have integrated attack.
Hmm.
Another portion of Mitre, called Mitre Ingenuity, organization over there called the Center for Threat Informed Defense, has done some mappings between 853 version 4 and version 5 to
Okay.
attack
Yep.
that I know a number of people are using. They've done some things with some other control sets as well, but 853 has been sort of the main one, CIS as well. But 853 v5 has been kind of the primary one, and they keep that up to date every couple attack releases.
And that's awesome too, because it gives you not just the compliance but also a way to test it. And I feel like attack maybe didn't give birth, but catapulted that breach and attack simulation um, uh, industry sub industry within cyber security. Is that true? And how's that going today?
We certainly grew up together,
Yeah, yeah,
and there
that's a
definitely
good way of
is
putting it. Yeah.
heavy use of attack in the breach and attack simulation space. Absolutely, that's when I'm seeing the Google hits for who's who's mentioning attack, that industry is often in the mix, and so yeah, and we also do see customers that are in some cases limiting companies, whether it's their red teaming contractors or their breach and attack simulators, to saying that you have to operate with an attack.
Mm,
And so it's not always that the companies necessarily wanted to use us,
hmm.
but they're finding themselves told they have to. We're
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah. Well, I mean, that's interesting. I mean,
I got
you
a
do want to
cough.
focus. Go ahead. You do want to focus your red team engagements on the right things. I think focusing your red team on what's being exploited in the wild is good, but at the same time, this depends on the circumstances. You don't want to limit them either, right? You want to give them some freedom, but you also want some of that coverage first. So I could see, if it were me, I would kind of split it up, be like, focus here, but then a certain part is like, be more creative outside of attack.
Absolutely. I think sometimes you want that simulation, that emulation, so that you can tie everything that you're doing back to, a solid reason, being able to say, we just tried the real stuff and you can't even handle that.
Yeah, yeah,
But
no,
I think
agreed.
there's also absolutely a space for, we want to push it as hard as we can. Sometimes you're testing in spaces where adversaries haven't done much.
Right.
If you want to try against a target where there just aren't techniques in attack because we don't have the threat intelligence on it, the answer is probably not. No, guess it's secure. It's that's definitely a time to go get creative and work outside the framework. And in fact, one of the worst practices we talk about is limiting yourself to attack.
Mm,
There's a lot of cases where just because something isn't explicitly an attack, we don't want people taking that as a don't do it. And so attack
right.
doesn't say upfront before you get to the framework, do patch management, do multi-factor authentication, um, do inventory management. But please probably do those things before you start using attack. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
attacks really big. It's a little bit complicated, and there are probably some basics that we don't tell you to do that you probably want to do first.
Well, it's interesting, if organizations get better at implementing attack, we're going to essentially force attackers to some of the fringe things that may not be in attack today, right? We mentioned EFI. The campaigns that I have seen are because the target demanded it, or the defenses have gotten a lot better and people's implementations of those defenses have gotten better. So now we're looking at, well, how do we just circumvent everything within the operating system? And if you're a gamer and you want to get around the anti-cheating, like, that's where they go, right? And I think it's only a matter of time before some of these techniques, like, pre-operating system exploits, get in there and start doing stuff. And that could be, probably a laundry list of things that, Adam, are coming that you're going to have to add, right?
We do see that space move slower, at least,
Mm.
than some things. It's the idea of the pyramid of pain. David Bianco's structure, talking about how painful is it for adversaries to move off of
Yes.
particular types of indicators. And so, where like hashes, IPs, domain names are super easy, a bit harder as you get through tools. With behaviors, tactics, techniques, procedures, the attack space being kind of the hardest. And so we absolutely see an arms race there, just like everything else. But we do see a slower arms race there where, attack doesn't have to update that many techniques per year
Right.
to keep
Right.
up with as adversaries shift. We do
Because
have
the
to do a
attackers
decent amount of work, but
because the attackers are staying with what works. And if it
Mhm.
works, why do I have to invest into all these other techniques that are more expensive in investment, but also maybe some riskier, right? They're not as proven.
well, often it's even just what works at 50% of places still too.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, and I think, we see that with the targets that the attackers now have on many firewall and VPN appliances, right? I mean, that's just I think many of us are not shocked by that, right? Those of us that have been in the industry for a long time are like, well, yeah, we knew they were there, but it got more popular, and it's no surprise, right, that they would do that for a lot of reasons. They're internet connected. Oftentimes, they're an appliance with little visibility and an unpatched OS under the covers, and that's where they're going to go. But those techniques that they're using on those devices are probably already in attack, right? It's just a different. The crosshairs are just on a slightly different segment of our tech stack.
Well, and attack isn't a way of tracking vulnerabilities. And
Mm,
so,
right.
if there is a new,
We needed to say that, Adam. Thank you. Yes.
Yes.
yeah, if
Yes.
there's a new 0 day out, there's not an attack technique for every single CV out there. CV is also MITRE, but
Yeah.
CV is far,
Different
far,
people.
far bigger than attack.
Yeah.
Um, and grows at a much faster pace. And so, we might have something that's just like, exploitation within initial access that covers tens or hundreds of thousands of CVs.
Right.
But
Right.
and those of us who've been around for a while have also seen this go in cycles,
Yeah.
where for a while we have adversaries going after externally facing systems and breaking in from the outside. As people do a lot more firewalls and hardening, we see a move back to spear phishing, move to social
Yep.
engineering. As people beef up their email defenses and put giant walls around that, they switch back to external penetration. I've seen
Yep.
at least 3 or 4 of those cycles since I've been in this space.
How do you see people using automation with Mitre Attack? Are you a big believer in automation, or how should we, once we get our bearings, implement automation that helps us identify the gaps that attack might be pointing out in our environments?
I think there's a huge place for getting ourselves out of a lot of repetitive activities. Like if you have responses that are always going to be the same to, say, a particular technique you see happening in a given place, absolutely automate that instead of having and have the human do sort of the deeper analysis or the one-off activity that they can stick to. And so I think always have to be careful, especially where if you're trying to say shut things down in response to any technique and attack. um, Again, there's lots of stuff in attack that system administrators do, and you're not going to be happy with the outcome.
Mm.
But if you're doing it in a rational way, where you're responding to particular techniques by taking specific mitigations or taking systems offline or disconnecting, I think there's a huge place for being able to do that and getting your security folks into the business of doing the hard that requires a human stuff.
What are you hearing people doing with Gen AI with respects to attack? Are they trying crazy things like, hey, here's a map of my network, here's an attack framework. Like, can you tell me all the valid paths? Like, I mean, we could experiment with that, and we should. I'm not confident the results would be entirely accurate today. But what are you hearing from the community, Adam?
So we're seeing some people use it for things like breach scenario planning.
Mm-hmm.
MITRE even has another open source tool called Caldera that
Mm.
has
Yep,
a
found
AI
Caldera.
based
Yep.
planner that's able to take sort of a map of the network, figure out using mostly attack techniques, different paths that it can
Oh,
take
I
through
didn't know that was
the
in
network.
Caldera. That's pretty cool. That must have been added later on, right? Because initially it was more like a scanner kind of thing, right? But it incorporates AI now. That's interesting.
Yeah, no, and so it does. It's not. it's not as sort of big and robust as sort of a commercial breach and attack simulator. It is still a
Sure.
relatively low resourced open source project from us. But it just as an example that I can talk about that's doing some of that. A lot of what we see with people using like large language models, though, in other spaces with attack isn't really working today.
Mm.
So it turns out that it is surprisingly hard to go from a written report to extract attack techniques out of it. It's an intelligence analysis problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
We see a lot of people we see a lot of people struggle with it. We see a lot of people where it just doesn't click, kind of going from the text they see in the report to an attack technique. And so for a lot of people, the answer is magic AI button.
Mm.
And so, train a large language model on all the text in attack and then throw it out a report. And then whatever technique IDs come out are the technique IDs. We have not seen precisions and recall on that sort of process that have
Yeah.
been usable.
I gotcha.
And
That's
we've
the
seen it.
answer I would expect right now. Right.
And there's a ton of attempts going on trying to do that, both in academia, because there's actually a ton of academic papers that leverage attack, as well as commercial work. And so we're not seeing it working yet. I mean, we're hopeful. I mean, large language models
Yeah.
are really powerful tools, but it's not there today. The training data doesn't seem to really be there.
Alan, you had some questions about some other Mitre Att&ck kind of projects and the future directions.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start with Attack Navigator. Walk me through that.
Mm.
Sure. And Attack Navigator is one of our original tools we put out that was to just allow people to visualize their attack coverage, their attack techniques that they had in a particular scenario. And so it's a really flexible tool that just starts with a empty map of the attack framework and can be built up a cell at a time, representing however you want it to. It could be how is your defensive coverage for a given space, what do you cover for a particular adversary. You can build up individual layers of that. And so multiple copies of the attack framework that you can then combine or subtract or look at side by side. It actually runs completely in JavaScript in your browser memory. And so there's no server either. Anything you're doing with those lives on your computer. We don't see any data from it. If you're mapping your company's individual defenses with the hosted copy of Attack Navigator we have, I mean, you can look at the source code. There is no server. It's
Beautiful.
running on completely static web page hosting. And so I hope for that to see some more usability over the coming years. Just right now, it's a little bit hard to use in that all of the buttons in it are sort of graphics with no labels unless you hover over them. And so, once you get to know it, I want to see the output cleaned up a bit so that it's got kind of nicer looking representations. But it's something where we are doing ongoing work, and it is open source. We absolutely are happy to take contributions in it, even though we're the primary developers.
I love that. So, we talked about Stix Taxi, we talked about GitHub, we talked about API, we talked about how the private sector is sort of onboarding and incorporating. We didn't get so much into the automation with SIM per se, but I think Stix Taxi probably answers that question. Is there anything else about SIM that deserves its own call out?
I mean, there still is a decent amount of work to do with going from sort of your logs to attack techniques in a SIM. You need something that is kind of doing that translation layer and recognizing the activities that are happening in a given log space. It's one of the reasons why we're putting out some of the pseudocode analytics, working our way across attack. Some SIMs have built-in attack support, whereas for some limited sets of data that they recognize, they're able to actually map it on their own into attack techniques. But it really isn't just you take all your company's data, you shove it in a SIM, and magically you have attack. It I wish that's the way the world worked, but it's a little bit more complicated than that.
And Alan, you had questions on the future of the project.
Yeah, just big picture view. Where the heck are we going? Where's Attack going next? Like, the sky's the limit with what y'all could be doing. I know you get inputs from probably every single person you
Mhm.
talk to about, oh, wouldn't it be cool if? What's the big picture roadmap? What's the vision?
We've heard a lot of proposals for Attack for X.
Mm-hmm.
But really, we're at is we don't see our core principles changing, which is that attack is a knowledge base of things that adversaries have done in the real world, supported by open information, and so that limits us somewhat. That limits us to spaces where adversaries have done enough things, and enough of it is in places we can use to pull it together. We don't want to use sort of completely private data sources because we end up building a roadmap for new adversaries. We kind of want to be in the middle there, where at least we're not the first source that they could have gotten it from. And we really do like that intelligence focus because it gives a grounding for limiting the scope. We think attack would be about 10 times the size it is today if we did everything that every red team, everybody's ever speculated about that you could do in an enterprise environment. And people get mad at us for how big attack is already. You'd be
Yeah.
a lot madder at us if we didn't have that intelligence. And so we're looking at, where is there enough intel? Is it, a VMware ESXi or a hypervisor platform? Is it something around Internet of Things? Do we have embedded devices where there's enough going on now? Or is that just an extension of Linux? I mean, yeah, there are other embedded operating systems, but most adversaries are just treating IoT devices like crummy Linux boxes. Yeah, and so that's sort of how we look at the world. Are there other broader spaces that are security related and make sense to us? Maybe insider threat, or something like that, where there definitely is intelligence out there. We know how some set of actors operate, and that space. We're also committed to trying to make attack simpler to use, trying to make our defensive information more accessible to a broader set of people, and just continuing to try to make attack as practical as we can for the broadest set of people.
I love it.
Fantastic. Adam, thank you so much for appearing on Below the Surface today.
Thank you for having me.
And with that, we will conclude the show. Thanks everyone for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.